Jake Thompson was driving his car through the quiet streets of Cleveland, Ohio as the evening set in. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. He was tired, but the loud music filling the interior of his car kept him alert. This was one of the few moments when he could relax after a long and exhausting day at the office, where he worked as a financial analyst for a local company. The chords of his favorite band echoed in his ears, causing him to daydream about the future he wanted to build with Sarah, his longtime girlfriend. "Ah, Sarah," he murmured to himself, an involuntary smile appearing on his face. They had been talking about plans for a romantic weekend, away from the everyday obligations. He imagined how perfect it would be to spend that time with her, away from everything, just the two of them, immersed in conversations and laughter. The dream of a future together seemed closer with each passing day. However, the tranquility of that night was about to be shattered. As Jake drove, lost in his thoughts, a car suddenly appeared out of nowhere, speeding the wrong way down the road. Jake's heart raced. He had no time to react. The impact was devastating, a deafening crash that echoed through the night. The world around him turned into a blur of lights and shadows, and the music that had once surrounded him was abruptly silenced. He found himself plunged into darkness, a deep darkness that swallowed him completely. When Jake awoke, there was no light, no sound. He was in a hazy space where time seemed not to exist. He had the sensation of floating, as if there was no weight on his shoulders. Yet something was wrong. He couldn't move, couldn't feel his body. The only thing that remained was his mind, which had now become an involuntary spectator. The first thing he heard was the sound of voices. They were soft but laden with an anguish that seemed to pierce through his consciousness. He forced himself to listen, trying to understand where he was and what had happened. The voices grew more distinct over time. He recognized his mother Linda's voice, and that of his brother, Mark. "I can't believe this is happening," Linda said, her voice trembling and full of emotion. "My son, please come back to us. You are everything we have." Mark tried to comfort their mother, but his own voice was choked with emotion. "Mom, the doctor said he's fighting. He can hear us. Jake, if you can hear us, please come back. We need you." Jake wanted to scream, to tell them he was there, that he could hear them, but he couldn't. The helplessness consumed him. He wanted to comfort his mother, to tell her everything would be okay, but all he could do was listen. Their conversation continued, revealing a deep-seated fear that Jake had never noticed before. "I don't know what I would do without him," Linda continued, now crying openly. "He's always been so strong, so dedicated, and I should have noticed that something was wrong. Work is consuming him, Mark. And Sarah, is she really doing the right thing?" His mother's words hit Jake like an arrow. He couldn't understand what she meant. What was wrong with Sarah? Weren't they happy together? He recalled the moments they had spent together, the laughter, the plans. But doubt began to gnaw at his mind. What did his mother mean? "She cares about him, Mom," Mark responded, trying to calm her. "She's here every day. You know that. She's just as worried as we are. But does she really love him? And what if she's with someone else?" Linda murmured, her voice now barely audible. "I just want my son back. If he wakes up, I promise I'll protect him from anyone who might hurt him again." Jake felt his heart tighten. His mother's words echoed in his mind, creating a storm of emotions. He wanted to believe that Sarah loved him, but doubt began to settle in his chest. What else didn't he know? What else was hidden beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life? Hours passed and the voices continued to echo around him. He heard Mark's concern, Linda's sadness, but he also began to pick up on other murmurs, other secrets. There was something more, something that the two seemed hesitant to discuss, but that Jake, in his current state, couldn't ignore. He started to understand that love and pain were intertwined in ways he had never imagined. "I don't know if I can do this, Mark," Linda said in a moment of vulnerability. "What happens if he doesn't wake up? What if he never knows what's happening around us?" Mark sighed heavily. "We need to have faith, Mom. Jake has always been a fighter. He will come back. I promise he'll take care of you and everything else. He won't be alone." Mark's words resonated with Jake, and he clung to them like a lifeline in a stormy sea. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that he would find his way back and confront the secrets lurking in the shadows of his life. But as the conversations continued, Jake realized that nothing would be the same. Life around him was unfolding in a narrative he had never imagined. And deep in his hazy mind, Jake began to wonder if he would ever see Sarah's face again, and if he did, whether he would be able to face the truth hidden behind every smile. The darkness surrounded him, but Jake was determined to fight. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was certain. When he woke up, he would face not only the battle for his life, but also the truths that surrounded him. He could no longer live in the shadows, and he was about to discover what it truly meant to love and be loved. Jake floated in a hazy space where the voices around him intertwined like distant echoes. The feeling of loss and despair enveloped him, but there was one constant element that stood out: Sarah. The words he had heard from her echoed in his mind, and each phrase felt like a dagger to his heart. "I can't believe he still hasn't figured it out," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as she spoke with her friend Amanda in a corner of the hospital. Jake couldn't see them, but he could feel their presence, and it was suffocating. He wanted to scream, to let her know he was there, listening, but he was trapped in his own darkness. "It's complicated, Sarah. What if he wakes up and finds out? What are you going to do?" Amanda questioned, her voice filled with concern. Jake felt a wave of anguish. He wanted to cry out to Amanda, to ask her to help him confront Sarah, the force that was keeping him bound in his pain. "I don't know, Amanda. I just don't know how to tell him. I don't want to lose Jake, but I can't keep living this lie," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. Jake's heart shattered even more. He remembered how she always seemed so perfect, so full of life. Now, the image of her was crumbling in his mind, revealing a side of her he never could have imagined existed. "You need to be honest with him. It's not fair to Jake, and you know that," Amanda insisted. With each word, Jake felt his anger growing. How could she talk like that? How could someone be so cruel? He wanted Sarah to know how much she was hurting him. He wanted her to understand that love wasn't just a game, that there were real consequences to her actions. "I know, but what if he doesn't forgive me? What if he decides he doesn't want to see me anymore?" "I can't bear that thought," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake felt helpless. He wanted to rise from the bed, look her in the eyes and ask why she hadn't been honest from the start. But he was trapped, merely a spectator in his own tragedy. The daily visits from his family began to take on the form of a ritual. Linda, his mother, always arrived with a weary but hopeful expression. Mark, his brother, often accompanied her, but Jake could sense that there was something more going on between them. He listened to their conversations, some light-hearted, others heavy with tension. "Be careful what you say, Mark. He can hear us, even if he can't speak," Linda said once, as she adjusted the flowers in the vase beside Jake's bed. "You know how he gets when he feels pressured." "I know, Mom, but I can't just sit here and wait. He needs to know that we're here for him, that he's not alone," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. Jake felt a tightness in his chest. He had always been close to Mark, and the thought of his brother struggling with his own demons filled him with anguish. But there was something Jake couldn't understand. Why did Mark never talk about his financial difficulties? The silence was deafening, and the truth seemed to hang in the air, but no one mentioned it. "I just hope he wakes up soon." "I need him here with me," Linda said, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know how to go on if something happens to him." The pain in his mother's voice was palpable, and Jake longed to comfort her, even if it was just with a touch. He wanted to tell her that he was fighting, that he was there, even if only in spirit. But his battle was internal, and he felt like a ghost in his own life. During another visit, Mark finally opened up a bit more. He was sitting beside Jake, his head bowed, fingers intertwined. "Jake," he began, "I hope you know that I feel like a failure. I'm not the brother you deserve. I'm struggling to keep things together, but the debts are piling up, and the last thing I want is for you to worry about that right now." Jake wanted to scream that Mark didn't need to feel that way, that they had always faced everything together. But Mark continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "I feel like I owe you more than just being your brother. I want to be someone you can rely on, but I've been feeling so lost. And now with you here, I don't know how to handle this." The anguish on Mark's face was clear, and Jake desperately wanted to understand what was really going on. He knew he couldn't do that just by listening. He wanted Mark to know that no matter the difficulties, they were family and would always stand by each other. But the sense of betrayal in his heart made everything more complicated. The conflicting emotions churned within him: love for his brother, concern for his family, and the painful realization that there were secrets and struggles he hadn't been aware of. Jake knew that when he finally woke up, he would have to face not only his own fears, but also the challenges that his family had been silently enduring. The conversations continued to unfold, and Jake felt increasingly entangled in the revelations. He didn't know if he was ready for what he was discovering, but the truth seemed to stir in his mind like a storm about to break. Every word he heard from Sarah and Mark was like a piece of a puzzle he had never asked to assemble. One day, Sarah returned to the hospital, and Jake could hear her talking with Mark. I'm so worried about him, Mark. What if he doesn't wake up? What if the guilt consumes me for everything I've done? Mark responded in a gentle voice, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his words. You need to be strong, Sarah. He needs to know that you're by his side no matter what happens. But you also need to be honest. We can't keep living with lies. Jake felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. The words from Sarah and Mark swirled in his mind, raising questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. What had Sarah done that filled her with so much guilt? And why did Mark insist so strongly on honesty? The storm of emotions within him grew stronger as he realized that waking up would mean confronting not just his physical reality, but the hidden truths that had come to light in his absence. Mark's words cut like a knife, and Jake felt a mix of anger and sadness swell within him. He wanted to confront them, to make them see how painful it was for him to hear all of this. But more than anything, he wanted Sarah to know that he still loved her, despite everything. There was a part of him that still believed they could overcome this, but the revelations had left him uncertain about the future. The sense of helplessness grew as time passed. He was trapped in a reality where he had no control, yet the voices of his family and Sarah echoed in his mind, challenging him to fight. He wanted to wake up, to face the truth head-on, but for now, all he could do was listen and wait. The weight of their words bore down on him, but deep inside, he knew that when the moment came, he would need to muster all his strength to confront the reality that awaited him. The fluorescent lights of the hospital cast a cold, impersonal glow over the room. Jake drifted between consciousness and the void, his mind a patchwork of memories and revelations. He could hear the voices of the doctors discussing his condition, their words echoing in his head like a haunting mantra. The coma is deep, one of them said. We're doing everything we can, but the situation is critical. The sense of helplessness enveloped him like a dense fog. He wanted to scream, to get up and show that he was still there, but his body refused to respond. The sterile environment around him only heightened his isolation, making the distance between his mind and his physical self feel even greater. The voices of his family, the doctors, and the haunting revelations from Sarah and Mark swirled in his consciousness, blending with the cold reality of his condition. Every word, every sound seemed to push him further into a space where time stood still, where he was trapped in a body that wouldn't listen to his desperate will to fight, to return to the life that now felt so far away. He's young and strong, the second doctor said, trying to convey a glimmer of hope. If there's any chance, it's now. Well, keep him under constant monitoring. The conversation continued, but Jake felt himself drifting further away, as if he were trapped in a limbo between life and death. He recalled the promises he had made to himself, that as soon as he woke up, he would confront the truths he had uncovered. But the strength that once surged within him now seemed harder and harder to reach. The world around him felt increasingly distant, the voices of the doctors fading into the background as his mind struggled to hold on to the resolve he had once felt. He knew that if he could just break free from the darkness, he could begin to piece together the shattered fragments of his life. Yet, the more he tried to reach for that inner strength, the more elusive it became, slipping through his grasp like sand through his fingers. The weight of everything he had heard and felt pressed down on him, threatening to pull him deeper into the abyss. And Jake found himself fighting not just for his life, but for the will to keep fighting at all. Meanwhile, his mother Linda's voice cut through his reflections. "Please, Jake, fight for us," she pleaded, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what we'll do without you." The pain in her tone was palpable, and Jake felt a wave of love and guilt wash over him. He wanted to comfort her, but only silence accompanied him. Memories of happy moments with his family flooded his mind, laughter around the dinner table, the feeling of unconditional support during tough times. But soon, these memories were overshadowed by the betrayals he had overheard. The contrast between the warmth of those cherished moments and the cold sting of recent revelations tore at him. He yearned to break free from the darkness, to tell his mother that he was still there, still fighting. But the weight of what he had learned made the struggle even harder. The love he felt for his family, for Sarah, was tangled with a growing sense of betrayal and doubt. He realized that waking up wouldn't just mean returning to the life he knew. It would mean confronting the pain that now loomed over the relationships he had once believed were unbreakable. The fight to return was no longer just physical. It was a battle to find the strength to face the truth and the people he loved. "He's fighting, isn't he?" Mark, his brother, asked, his voice heavy with anxiety. "I can't lose my brother. I just can't." The sincerity in Mark's words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He wanted to believe that there was truth in them, that Mark genuinely cared. But the image of Mark talking with Sarah, laughing and sharing secrets, overshadowed any hope he tried to hold on to. What else didn't he know? The uncertainty gnawed at him, twisting his emotions into a painful knot. Every word from Mark now felt tainted, clouded by the doubts that had taken root in his mind. He struggled to reconcile the brother he had always trusted with the person who seemed to be hiding something. The more he thought about it, the more questions arose. What other secrets had been kept from him? Who could he really trust when he woke up, if he ever did? Jake realized that returning to consciousness meant not just rejoining the life he had left behind, but unearthing the hidden truths that had been buried in his absence. It was a daunting thought, but deep down, he knew he had to find out. If not for himself, then for the sake of the love he still felt for his family, even through the haze of betrayal and doubt. The hours dragged on, and Jake found himself trapped in a spiral of memories and questions. Flashbacks of past moments surged, a whirlwind of smiles and promises. He remembered the day he met Sarah, how his heart raced at the sound of her laughter, the instant connection that had seemed magical. The nights they walked together, dreaming of the future, were now a source of torment, as he wondered if it had all been an illusion. "How could you do this to me, Sarah?" The question echoed in his mind, and he found himself wishing she could hear it. "I loved you." The thought consumed him, and the pain of betrayal turned into a silent scream within his soul. He wanted to know if, when she looked at him, she felt even a fraction of the guilt that now weighed so heavily on him. Had she thought of him at all while surrendering to someone else's embrace? As night drew closer, Jake struggled to hold on to his clarity. He wanted to cling to every fragment of hope, but the betrayals he had overheard grew into an overwhelming shadow. He couldn't just ignore what he now knew. What was he supposed to do with this information? How could he face the reality that was unraveling before him? Then a comforting presence enveloped his mind. It was as if a gentle light was illuminating the shadows that threatened to consume him. He remembered moments of love, promises of happiness that made him feel that everything was still worth fighting for. "I will fight," he thought, a growing determination taking hold of him. "I can't let them win. I can't let this betrayal define who I am." The warmth of this newfound resolve began to push back the darkness that had been closing in on him. The love he once felt, the dreams he had cherished, weren't just fading memories. They were the fuel he needed to fight back, to reclaim his life. He realized that the betrayal he had experienced didn't have to destroy him. Instead, it could be the catalyst for his resurgence, a reason to rise above the pain and take control of his destiny. The memories of Sarah laughing and joking blended with images of Mark, always supporting him. "I need to find the truth," he decided. "I need to understand what's happening. I can't let this break me." It was a call from love, a desire to reconnect with what truly mattered. He wanted to return to life, not just to confront those who had betrayed him, but to discover who he really was, beyond the lies and disappointments. This realization fueled his determination. Jake understood that his journey back wasn't just about facing the people who had hurt him, but about rediscovering his own strength, his own identity. He couldn't allow the actions of others to define him. He needed to take control, to peel back the layers of deceit and reveal the truth, both about the people he loved and about himself. With each breath he forced himself to feel, Jake's determination grew stronger. He knew that once he woke up, he would need to face not only Sarah and Mark but also himself. He needed to understand why things had come to this point, why the love he had believed to be unshakable had turned into a battlefield. The questions that plagued his mind weren't just about their actions, they were about his own. What had he missed? Had he been too consumed by his own world to see the cracks forming in his relationships? The thought of confronting the truth was daunting, but Jake knew it was necessary. He couldn't move forward without understanding the past, without facing the reality of who he had become and what had led them all to this moment. The days dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Jake found himself on an emotional roller coaster, with feelings of betrayal mingling with flashes of love. He didn't want to lose hope. The thought of a life without Sarah filled him with anguish, but the truth he had heard couldn't be ignored. "If I wake up," he promised himself, "I will face all of this head on." And so, amidst the darkness, Jake began to find a new light. He remembered that even in the shadows, there was a spark of hope. The love that had once bound him to Sarah and Mark still existed, even if it had been torn apart. With this new perspective, he prepared himself for the battle that lay ahead. He was ready to fight, not just for his life, but for the truth that needed to be uncovered. "I can't let myself be defeated," he repeated mentally, as the voices around him became a distant echo. "I will come back." And with that determination, Jake began to visualize the future he desired, a future where lies would not control him, where he could rewrite his story. The fight for his life was just beginning. Jake was in a hazy state, trapped within his mind, an internal battle raging as his memories and the whispers around him intertwined. He struggled to remember who the people he loved truly were, while the pain of newly discovered betrayals consumed him. Jake's determination grew with each passing moment, a burning flame that refused to be extinguished. He knew that if he woke up, he would confront Sarah and Mark about the dark secrets that now echoed in his mind. The conversations he overheard surrounded him like shadows, and he found himself in an emotional battlefield, fighting against confusion and betrayal. He remembered the promises he had made to Sarah, the moments of happiness they had shared, and how it had all crumbled in an instant, like a house of cards. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind, confessing her affair, and the pain from that revelation was nearly unbearable. He wondered if there was still enough love left to overcome all of this. During those days in a coma, Jake overheard his mother, Linda, speaking with a nurse about his condition. Her voice was gentle, but the sadness was unmistakable. "I didn't know he was going through this. I should have noticed the changes. How could a mother be so blind?" The guilt consumed her. Jake wanted to scream, to comfort her, but he was trapped in a body that wouldn't respond. He struggled not just with his own pain, but with the pain he was causing his mother. During that visit, Mark entered the room with his head bowed, clearly shaken. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I should have been a better brother. I should have noticed he was sinking," he murmured, his voice trembling with regret. Jake heard Mark's words and felt the weight in his heart grow heavier. Mark had always been the protector, always there in times of crisis. But now Jake realized that his brother was battling his own inner demons. "He's still here, Mark. We need to be strong for him," Linda replied, trying to hold on to hope. She held Jake's hand, gently stroking it as if she could transmit strength through her touch. Jake longed for her to know that he was there, that he was listening and fighting. He wanted them to know that despite everything, the love he felt for them still existed, even amid the betrayal and pain. "I just wish we could go back in time and change everything," Mark said, frustration evident in his voice. "If I had been more present, maybe this wouldn't have happened." His guilt was overflowing, and Jake desperately wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that life was complicated and full of unexpected twists. As Jake listened, he felt torn between the love he had for his family and the pain of the revelations that surrounded him. He wanted to forgive, but how could he when the betrayal was still so fresh in his mind? The internal battle intensified, and his determination to confront Sarah and Mark grew stronger. If he had the chance, he would confront them about their lies, about how deeply he felt betrayed by both of them. That night, Jake found himself in a place of clarity. He was aware that he needed to fight, not just for himself but for his family. He needed to understand what had happened, needed to confront the truth, and this truth would lead him down a path of self-discovery he had never anticipated. The days dragged on, and the sunlight filtered through the hospital window. With each visit, Jake heard more and more about what was happening outside of his body. He listened as his mother spoke with Mark about how helpless she felt. "I always thought I had control over things, that I could protect my children from any pain. But now, it feels like everything is falling apart," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Jake's heart ached as he absorbed her words. He had always seen his mother as a pillar of strength, someone who could weather any storm. Hearing her speak of her feelings of powerlessness made him realize how much his situation was affecting those he loved. The pain she carried, the weight of guilt and fear, was almost too much for him to bear. The pain in his mother's words cut Jake deeply. He wanted her to know that despite everything he had heard, the love they shared was still powerful. He wished she wouldn't feel guilty, that she could understand the choices they made, though painful, were part of the complexity of life. He wanted to scream, to tell her that she wasn't to blame, that life wasn't so simple. "I don't want Jake to feel alone when he wakes up. He needs to know that he's surrounded by love," Mark said, the sincerity in his voice echoing off the walls of the room. Mark's desire to be there for Jake was clear, and it warmed Jake's heart. He wanted to believe that despite the mistakes, there was still room for reconciliation. With each visit, Jake felt his determination grow stronger. He was ready to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He knew this was part of his recovery. If he wanted to return to life, he needed to confront the reality of his family's choices. And even though it would be difficult, he felt it was the only way to move forward. One day, the sunlight shone more brightly than before, and Jake felt a shift in his body. It was as if the light was penetrating his mind, bringing with it a sense of hope. He felt like he was getting closer to the surface, closer to consciousness. The voices around him became sharper, clearer, as if they were drawing nearer to him. He heard the nurse enter and check his vital signs. "Come on, Jake, you can do this. We're all rooting for you," she said, her voice soft and encouraging. He wanted to respond, to show that he was fighting, that he was ready to come back. But his voice was still trapped in his throat, and the struggle to break free was intense. He remembered the conversations he had overheard, the truths he needed to confront. He knew that when he woke up, life wouldn't be the same. He would have to deal with the pain of betrayal, with the weight of the guilt his family carried, but above all, he wanted to reconnect with them, to find a path toward healing. "We're with you, brother. You're not alone," Mark said during a visit, his voice full of emotion. "I promise I'll do everything I can to make things right between us." Jake longed for Mark to know that, despite everything, he still believed they could find their way back to each other. And so, as the daylight streamed through the window, Jake fought to wake up. He felt he was getting closer, that life was still waiting for him, full of challenges, but also full of love and the potential for healing. He was ready to face whatever came next, ready to confront Sarah, Mark, and the painful truths that, though difficult, could lead to liberation. The battle was just beginning, but Jake was determined to fight. Jake finally opened his eyes. The blinding glare of the hospital lights made him squeeze them shut again, but reality soon crashed over him like a tsunami. He was back, but in a way he had never imagined. The smell of disinfectant and the distant beeping of heart monitors were now part of his new reality. A deep fear gripped him as he realized that everything had changed. What was he supposed to do now? The echoes of the conversations he had overheard while in a coma still lingered in his mind, like shadows refusing to fade away. As he tried to adjust, memories began to flood in. Glimpses of laughter, tender moments with Sarah, afternoons spent with Mark. But behind these memories loomed a heavy cloud of distrust and betrayal. Jake struggled to sit up, but the effort was nearly unbearable. He was weak, but a burning determination flared within him. He needed to know the truth, to confront the people he loved, who now felt like strangers. The moment Sarah entered the room, Jake's heart raced. She hesitated, offering a sad smile that couldn't mask the anxiety in her eyes. Jake watched her, trying to read her emotions. The silence between them was heavy, thick with tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. "Jake, you're awake," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She moved closer to the bed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't believe you're here." Jake took a deep breath, feeling a tumultuous mix of love and anger. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse and weak, but steady. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. Sarah's expression shifted from relief to apprehension as she realized that this conversation was inevitable. She nodded slowly, knowing that the time had come to face the truth. Sarah hesitated as if she knew what was coming. "Of course, but you need to rest." No, I don't want to rest," Jake interrupted, the frustration clear in his voice. "I heard you, Sarah. I heard everything while I was there." Her face went pale, and Jake saw the truth reflected in her eyes. "Jake, I didn't want you to find out like this. I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Jake pressed, his emotions boiling over. "Afraid to tell me you were betraying our relationship? Is that what you were afraid of?" Tears started to stream down Sarah's face, and she leaned forward as if she were about to collapse. "I didn't want to hurt you," she cried, her voice trembling. I don't know how it happened. It was a mistake, Jake, a terrible mistake." "A mistake?" Jake repeated, incredulity lacing his words. "A mistake is forgetting to put sugar in the coffee. That's not how you describe betrayal." The tension in the room thickened, and Jake felt the weight of his words. He was hurt, and the pain he felt inside was becoming an open wound. He wanted her to understand the gravity of what she had done. But as he looked at her, he realized there was also a deep yearning for understanding, to know why she had chosen that path. "Why did you do it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice softer now. "What was missing between us?" She took a deep breath, trying to collect herself. I was feeling alone, Jake. You were so focused on your work and I didn't know how to tell you. I sought comfort in someone else. It wasn't right, and I deeply regret it." Sarah's words pierced Jake like an arrow. The loneliness she described was something Jake had felt too, but had never been able to articulate. The weight of guilt began to settle on his chest, and he wondered if he was ready to forgive. But before he could respond, Mark walked into the room, breaking the tense moment. "Hey, Jake," Mark said, his voice full of relief. "I was so worried about you." Mark's presence in the room was like a splash of cold water. Jake looked at his brother, feeling a fresh wave of conflicting emotions. As Mark approached, Jake realized that he too was part of the pain he was grappling with. "Mark," Jake began, the tension clear in his voice, "you need to know that I heard everything. About Sarah, about how you feel about me." Mark stopped abruptly, his eyes wide with shock. "What do you mean by that?" "I heard you talking to Sarah, about how you feel, about how you care more about her than you do about me. Did you ever wonder why you were so close to her while I was fighting for my life?" Mark hesitated, his face a mix of guilt and confusion. "Jake, I didn't want you to find out. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Wasn't supposed to be like this?" Jake repeated, almost laughing bitterly. "And how was it supposed to be, Mark? You were there, talking to her about me while I was in a coma. How can you tell me you care about me when you were betraying our relationship as brothers?" The tension in the room grew thick, and Mark's expression shifted to one of defensiveness. "I wasn't betraying you. I just wanted to help Sarah. She was so lost and I didn't know what to do." "You helped her lose herself even more," Jake fired back, feeling a surge of strength with each word. "You didn't care about what you were doing to me. You only thought about yourself." Mark, now visibly shaken, glanced back at Sarah, who remained silent, tears streaming down her face. "That's not true, Jake. I just wanted everyone to be okay. I'm your brother." "And what does that mean, Mark?" Jake demanded, the pain evident in his voice. "Everything was fine between us until you decided to cross a line that should never have been crossed. How can you expect me to trust you again?" The silence that followed was deafening. Jake was surrounded by the people he loved, but now it all felt like it was crumbling around him. The betrayal cut deep like a sharp blade, and the wounds didn't seem to have any chance of healing. I don't know what to say," Mark finally whispered, his voice filled with despair. "I just wanted you to be okay. I didn't want you to find out like this." "And I didn't want to know," Jake replied, his voice steady. "But now that I do, I can't ignore it. From now on, I need to be honest with myself. And the first truth is that I can't trust either of you." Jake stared at the two of them, a mix of anger and pain swirling in his chest. The people he loved now stood before him, exposed, and Jake was determined not to let their betrayal define him. He felt a surge of strength even in the midst of the pain. The fight for the truth was just beginning. Jake turned away from Sarah and Mark, his mind still in turmoil after the emotional explosion of their confrontation. He walked through the hospital corridors, the strong scent of alcohol and the constant hum of machines surrounding him. Each step felt heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of his discoveries. But at the same time, there was a growing lightness within him, a sense that he now had control, even though the wounds were still raw. He found a small bench in an isolated corner, away from the curious eyes of visitors and staff. Sitting down, he took a deep breath, trying to sort through the thoughts that crowded his mind like dark clouds before a storm. "Forgive," he murmured to himself, testing the word on his tongue. It was an idea that felt so distant, so difficult. But at the same time, Jake knew he needed to consider it, not just for Sarah and Mark, but most importantly for himself. The anger and betrayal were consuming him, and he couldn't let them define his recovery. "Why did you do it, Sarah?" he asked aloud, feeling the sting of betrayal tighten in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me?" But deep down, Jake understood that the answers he sought wouldn't come from Sarah. They had to come from within himself. He needed to confront his own demons before he could face anyone else. As he reflected, a nurse walked by, casting a curious glance his way. Jake offered a faint smile, trying not to seem so lost. But the truth was, he was. The life he had known was crumbling around him, and he needed to find a way to rebuild it. The idea of forgiveness, of freeing himself from the chains of bitterness, began to take shape in his mind. The next day, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, his body still weak, but the determination within him growing stronger. The sunlight streamed through the window, softly illuminating the room, as if the light were trying to tell him that there was hope. He knew he needed to talk to Mark again, but he couldn't do it while he was still consumed by anger. He needed clarity. "Mark," Jake began as his brother entered the room, worry etched on his face. "We need to talk." Jake's voice was steady, but there was a vulnerability in it that he couldn't hide. "Of course, Jake. What do you want to talk about?" Mark asked, visibly nervous, as if he knew what was coming. Jake took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He knew this conversation would be difficult, but it was necessary. He needed to understand, to find a way to move forward. even if that meant confronting the pain head-on. About you and Sarah. Jake stared intently at his brother, watching as Mark swallowed hard. I heard everything, and I need to understand what was going on. Mark hesitated, his expression contorting with a mix of guilt and fear. Jake, look, I never wanted you to find out like this. I never wanted to hurt you, but you did. And it wasn't just me, it was all of us. Jake felt the pressure building in his chest. Were you planning what to do if something happened to me? How could you do that? The pain in Jake's voice was unmistakable. I don't know, Mark said, his voice choked with emotion. Things just kept getting more complicated. I felt lost. And Sarah, she gave me attention when I needed it most. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted you to get hurt. But you did hurt me, Mark. And now, I need you to tell me the truth. Jake leaned forward, his eyes locked on his brother's. You love me, right? So why didn't you tell me about the problems you were facing? Because I didn't know how, Mark admitted, his voice filled with regret. I didn't want to burden you. I always thought you were too busy with your life, your work, with Sarah. He looked down, ashamed. And when I realized I was falling for her, I thought I could fix things without dragging you into it. Resolve things without involving your brother who was in a coma? That's your idea of love? Jake felt the indignation rise, but also a weakness within himself. What you did was a betrayal. And now, I don't know if I can ever trust you again. Jake, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were listening. I was so lost in my own pain that I didn't think about the consequences, Mark pleaded, his eyes filled with tears. Please, forgive me. Forgiving isn't easy, Mark. I'm still trying to process all of this. Jake took a deep breath, trying to hold back the storm of emotions swirling inside him. But I know I need to do it, not just for you, but for me. Mark nodded, relieved. I'll fight for this. I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. I hope you do. Jake looked out the window, watching the leaves on the trees gently sway in the wind. I need time. I just want to heal and figure out who I am again. As the days passed, Jake began to explore the idea of forgiveness. He distanced himself from Sarah and Mark, deciding that he needed to find his own identity, away from the shadows of betrayal. He started keeping a journal, writing down his thoughts and feelings, allowing himself to process the pain, but also to embrace the hope of a new beginning. It was on one of those afternoons that Jake stumbled upon messages on his phone, which had been left on but unused for so long. The messages were between Mark and Sarah, revealing a deeper plan than Jake could have ever imagined. He read a conversation that mentioned a future together, a future that didn't include Jake. The betrayal became even more intense, and the pain inside him ignited into a burning flame. How could you, Mark? He murmured, his hand trembling as he held the phone. You didn't just betray my trust, but also Sarah's. Jake knew he couldn't let this go unnoticed. The realization that the betrayal ran deeper than he had initially thought tore at him, but he also understood that he needed to take action. With a heavy heart, Jake made the decision to go to the local police department and report the financial fraud he had uncovered. The decision wasn't easy. It was a painful acknowledgement that the people he had once trusted most had been plotting behind his back. But Jake also knew that this was a necessary step to free himself from the chains that had been holding him down. He couldn't allow their betrayal to define his life any longer. When the police finally confronted Mark, Jake watched from a distance, a mix of relief and sadness filling his heart. He knew it was the price to pay for betrayal, and that, despite everything, he still loved his brother. But the need to free himself and find his own voice was stronger. That night, Jake sat on his bed, looking out the window at the starry sky. He reflected on his journey, on the pains and joys that were yet to come. I'm ready for a new beginning, he whispered to himself, a smile forming on his lips. I choose to forgive myself. I choose to love myself. And so that night, Jake made a promise to himself. He would no longer be a victim of the circumstances surrounding him. He was determined to rebuild himself, to find the strength that had always existed within him, and from that pain, a new life would blossom. A life without the shadows of betrayal, but full of light and hope. This story reminds us that even in the most difficult situations, we can always find the strength to rebuild ourselves and flourish. Jake's journey is a powerful example of how we can transform pain into hope and move forward, even when everything seems to be falling apart. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share your reflections in the comments. We would love to know, what would you do if you were in Jake's place? How would you deal with forgiveness and betrayal? Let's talk and support each other on this journey of healing and rebirth.